Good evening, and welcome to Restored Lore, your home for old, odd, and obscure stories. Tonight's story is A Twopenny Ghost Story by James Hain Friswell. This story comes from Friswell's Ghost Stories and Phantom Fancies, published in 1858. Not to contradict Friswell in his own work, but this is not a ghost story. It's a story in the genre of inanimate objects come to life. It isn't remotely ghostly or spooky, but very interesting and passionate. For a better example of Friswell's ghost stories, try The Dead Man's Story, which I will link on screen here. But now, let's open our imaginations and begin. For certain little boys. It was not a very long time ago that a little boy was passing along a certain street in London which leads down to a great hospital where other little boys live who have no fathers and whose mothers seldom come to see them. The name of the street is Lamb's Conduit Street, and the name of the little boy was Harry Summers. Of course, it was very natural for little Harry to look into the shop windows where books with pretty pictures or grand pictures or touching pictures stood. And of course also it was natural in him to wait and wonder at the toy shops wherein King Nutcracker with such very great jaws and great staring eyes stood, and where certain balloons and bats and balls and cricket stumps and ninepins were all ranged, not to mention also the little fleecy dogs with bright red cloth tongues, bead eyes, and a bark much like a feeble puff through a penny trumpet as anything could be. But what struck Harry the most was a long box, like a domino box, in which there lay two very pretty painted fish, which had apparently not long been caught, for they had pieces of hooks or of iron pins sticking out of their mouths, and of these Harry knew the use. For these fish would swim in a basin of water, and when a little boy or girl dropped down the clumsy hook into the water, the fish were, somehow or another, drawn to it, and they swam towards it, and touched it with their bits of iron, and so were drawn up and caught. Well, Harry went on, wondering and longing to have some of these, but not envying those who had them, being a good boy, and easily contented with his trap, bat, and ball, and his fine kite at home. So he left that wonderful toy shop and went on. He had not gone very far, and had not done laughing at the cowardice of a great rough curly dog which ran away from a very fierce little terrier, when he came to a shop which was almost as wonderful as the toy shop. It was that of a tea dealer and grocer, and in the window all sorts of pleasant things were to be seen. There were rich pots of marmalade and jams piled upon one another in such quantity that Harry thought that all the boys of his school, if they were to carry one each away, would not be able to exhaust the shop. Then, in another place, were brown Normandy pippins with their rough coats and their flat tops, looking very nice and homely. Then raisins and almonds, such boxes of the one and such quantities of the other that Harry felt that even he would have been a very long time in finishing them. And then, besides all these, as if these were not enough for a moderate grocer, there was a perfect horn of plenty of sugar candy, and a profusion of boxes of French plums, cases of tea tilted on one side as if they had just been overturned, while from their mouths the fragrant, curly, green or black leaf poured out. The grocer was, and must have been, a very rich man, so Harry thought. For besides all these treasures, and besides also all the ripe Portugal grapes, red and white, and the boxes of figs which were beside them, in the middle of the window was a bowl of bright penny pieces which twinkled in the sun and looked as if they were gold. Little Harry never saw such new pennies before, and was quite astonished at the grocer for keeping them there, yet there they were. And the man was not content in piling the bowl up in a pyramid-like form, but several had dropped over, as if this rich grocer did not care for penny pieces, but could afford to let them lie in his window in that manner. Now, the more Harry looked at these penny pieces, the more he wanted them. That is, not all of them, but one of them, and he declared to himself that he should only like to take one home to show his sister. So he looked and thought, and put his hand in his pocket and felt a sixpence there, which his mother had given him the day before. He had serious thoughts of going in and asking the grocer if he would give him a penny piece for the sixpence, but as a spruce young mechanic looks better than an old worn-out nobleman, so the sixpence looked so thin and worn and old and poor that little Harry was absolutely ashamed to go and ask such a favor. Now it happened that the grocer had a very smart young fellow, a shopman, who used sometimes to walk to the door and ask the customers to walk in and purchase. He had a great deal to say, and he said it, and he was quite a favorite with his master on account of the number of customers which he coaxed into his shop. He came out directly he saw Harry, and spoke to him confidently, saying, "Now, my little man, what would you like? These are very nice figs." And as he said this, he looked, the sly fellow, at the sixpence in little Harry's hand, and said, "And I'll tell you what we'll do." He said we because he meant himself, and the master, and the shop, and all, in fact, he was such a great fellow. "And I'll tell you what we'll do. We'll give you half a pound of those nice figs to take home to your mamma, and a bright new penny piece into the bargain, for that sixpence." Harry jumped at the very idea, and thought what a lucky young fellow he was, and went inside at once, and was all of a tremble till he had the packet of figs tied up in a neat parcel by the generous young shopman in one hand, and the new penny piece put into a little envelope with the grocer's name upon it, just as if it had been made on purpose, in his pocket. He could not eat the figs for thinking of his penny piece, and quite surprised his mother by his generosity. Indeed, that kind lady was so touched by her son's kindness that she immediately gave him another sixpence and a great part of the figs, just enough for him to eat without making him ill, as a reward. And further, she told his father and his brothers and his sister what a good boy he was. Now, Harry was a good boy, and did not like to be praised for that which he did not quite deserve, and when his mother said, "And to think he did not eat one of the figs!" little Harry told her how the shopman proposed it, and how he had got the bright penny piece, and he showed the little envelope with the grocer's name on it, where the bright penny lay quite comfortably. It was his father's turn to laugh now, and he laughed out with a great loud laugh, and called Harry to him, and gave him a kiss on his forehead, for he was more fond of kissing Harry's little sister than he was Harry, and told him that he was indeed a good boy for speaking the truth, and looked at his penny, and offered him sixpence for it. And when Harry would not take it, he called him a blockhead, and gave him the sixpence. But all this time Harry's mother looked rather disappointed, and he, who was now rich and could afford it, therefore, walked up to her and offered her the penny piece and the sixpence to make her smile. So she smiled, and told him to take them away and put them in his money-box. Little Harry at once did this, and unlocked the box, and put the two sixpences together, and the bright penny piece in another partition, with an old, smooth, dark penny, nearly black and very ugly, which Harry had had for ever so long a time. When he saw the two pennies together, Harry despised the old one, and took the bright penny out and put it with the sixpence, and he was not even satisfied then, for he took it out again to look at it. It was such a fine thing, so thick, so heavy, so bright, so sharp in its stamp. It had letters all round it, and on one side there was the head of a very good and handsome lady, who was our queen, with a quantity of words in Latin, which Harry could not make out. And on the other side there was Britannia, with her shield and trident, looking very firm, and with her shield leaning against the rock upon which she sat, and upon it were the crosses of St. Andrew and St. George. Underneath this grand lady's feet were three flowers, the rose, the shamrock, and the thistle, which, as Harry had heard tell, were the symbols of England, Ireland, and Scotland. And in her hand was a trident, which showed, said the people, that she ruled the sea. But the reason of her bearing the trident, the sceptre of the ancient god of the sea, was, at the time, not very plain to Harry. The old smooth penny piece had a face upon it too, but it was not so very pretty as the face of the Queen, and as for the Britannia on the other side, it was an old worn-out figure, with no helmet or armor on her breast, and looking like a very poor thing in comparison with the other. So Harry kept looking at his bright penny piece till it was time to go to bed, and when it was so, he put away his bright penny piece with the sixpences, and, leaving the old one quite solitary by itself, little Harry went to bed, and kept on thinking of his fine new penny till he went to sleep. He had not been long asleep when he had a dream. Somehow or other, for he did not know how, the bright penny piece came out of its box and stood by his bed. Although he knew it was the penny, yet it was only the beautiful Lady Britannia who stood near him, her bright helmet shining, her armor twinkling, and her scarlet robe rustling as it fell over her shoulder like the robe of a queen. She held her shield, also of bright steel, but painted beautifully in the center, on her hand, and her arms were bare and beautifully white and round, and looked like those of a marble goddess. Little Harry was quite charmed with her, and at the same time quite alarmed. Presently he heard the lid of the little money box lift up and shut down again, and then the little old lady from the other penny piece came also and stood by him. There was never such a contrast as between these two ladies. The one was old, worn, and infirm, and looked more like a shadow than anything else. The other stood upright and firm, and looked like a queen. The shield of the eldest was rusty, and it had nothing on it. Her trident also had lost its head, and looked more like an old stick. That of the youngest was sharp and dreadful to look at, being so glittering and pointed, and her shield was painted and ornamented, and its bright edge glittered like a looking-glass. Her robes were also beautiful and cleanly, and hung with ample and majestic folds, but those of the eldest clung round her worn body, and looked almost as shadowy as herself. Harry had not done wondering when they both looked at him and spoke. "I," said the first, the bright, glittering, beautiful lady who looked so much like the Britannia on a Christmas transparency, "I am the genius of the new penny piece. I am untouched, unsullied, pure. No dirty hands have handled me. I am fit to be placed in the cabinet of a savant, to be examined by the glass of a numismatist." Little Harry rather opened his eyes at the very big words which the little spirit spoke. But he thought, and perhaps rightly, that fine words and fine clothes should go together, so he said nothing. The fine lady continued, with a pretty curl of disdain upon her beautifully cut lips, sweeping away, with a fine free dash, her crimson robe, which fell heavily, it may be, for it was rich and new, a little, just a little, too near the worn old figure by her side. "I have said that I am unsullied. I am pure. I am absolutely unused to the world's ways. But I know my own value." "Certainly," thought Harry. "And it may be," says the reader, "a little above it. But then grand people, just fresh from the mint, frequently mistake a little in that way." "I have never," she said, "been given away for watercresses, nor for penny loaves, nor for hearthstone, nor lucifer matches, no, nor for cat's meat." The withering way in which she said the last word was a wonder to hear. The word took effect like a chain shot. The poor, ragged, withered figure seemed to quiver, to shrink, to bend under it, and shook and trembled so much that little Harry mixed up some pity with the great deal of contempt which he felt for her. And very properly so, too, for little boys like Harry are not bound, no, nor sometimes taught nowadays, to feel any reverence for poverty and age, especially when accompanied by so foolish a thing as lowliness or meekness. Though, to be sure, the author of this foolish, but true, story has met with an obscure book which speaks of poverty as a blessing, and of age as an honor. "I have never," continued the imperial little puppet, been tossed by the boys, never been dropped into beggars' hats, nor thrown to serenaders, nor to tumbling clowns. No, nor paid away for lollipops, sugar sticks, withered apples, and Bonaparte's ribs, and therefore, she continued, with much dignity, tucking her pretty little waxen arms akimbo, and making a low curtsy to Harry, and therefore I will thank you, sir, not to confine me in the same apartment with such a person, how cuttingly she said the word, as the present. Harry thought that the word apartment was rather a grand term for his money-box, but the word was so suited to the speaker's lips that he could not feel annoyed with it. And, to be sure, the lady was so fresh and riante that she might well have claimed the precedence she did, and by a brevet rank have been placed with the new shillings and sixpences, and have had a quantity of bright threepenny pieces to reign over as her subjects. Sometimes, you know, a good subject is worth 3 times as much as a monarch, for which fact we refer to the present Spanish currency, or have been moved up higher, and have consorted with the sovereigns and half-sovereigns, had Harry's money-box contained any. The little withered woman now thought it was her turn to speak. Twice she tried, and twice tears intermingled with sighs found out their way. Hello, I fancy I have met that combination of sounds before. Oh, Mr. Milton, is that it? Thank you. You are surprised at being quoted in a spirit story? Well, so am I. At length a little squeaky voice, but very, very sad. Squeaky, I said, for poverty does not always, and age very seldom, speak in grand, solemn tones. At length this voice began, and somewhat to Harry's ears, in this way. I am old, very old, and very weak and poor. I am very nearly worn out. They always begin in this way, cried the imperial figure, as if we cared for their catalogue of sorrows. Not a bit. It is quite true what her Majesty hath said. I have been in very sorry company, said the figure. But I suppose it was my fate. I was born a very great while ago. I have seen a great deal of life, and am very tired of it, and am nearly worn out. And a good job, too, I should think, when you are quite so, said the other lady, very proudly. We have really, nowadays, a great too many poor people about. What they mean by it I do not know. They pester us in the streets, they look at us in a hungry way when we go near any baker's shops, or if we happen to step into the confectioner's to take an ice. They bother us with violets in the early spring and winter, as if we cared for violets. A camellia only suits my hair. They trouble us in many, many ways. On opera nights the real poor run along by the side of our carriages, pushing at the glass windows as if they would break them, with programs and words of the opera, as if we cared for the words of an opera. We only go to hear the music, you know. As for the streets, I'm sure it is quite dreadful, because you really now cannot step from your jeweller's into your brougham but what a pale face haunts you with an impudent look, as much as to say, what business have you to buy that trinket whilst I starve? A pretty pass it has come to, forsooth. Here the figure tossed her robe again, and swept away further from the other in great disdain. It is to be observed that she talked very highly for only a penny piece, but a great many more people in this funny world talk of broughams than ride in them, and the writer has noted that many a penny-piece lady in society talks quite as loudly as if she were a half-crown, or 5 shillings at least. I was born as well as that lady, continued the worn figure. A duchess was my great-grandmother, Frances Stuart, her Grace of Richmond, a great lady in the time of Charles II, I claim as my progenitrix. The figure looked a little more proudly as she said this, and the other lady opened her eyes a little. I was born in the Mint, and was as bright and beautiful as the lady here when I first saw the world. perhaps more so. I was more like my great-great-grandmother, I'm sure. My trident was unbroken, my shield fresh and new, my robe unworn. You see how ragged it is now. The first few years of my life were perhaps the saddest. I saw the light when old King George III was a young man. We call him old now. It is hard to think that he was once young. I bear his head upon me as a mark that I was his liege slave. A good citizen of London, going to change a note, brought me from the bank, and with a new sixpence and threepenny piece I was given in a little yellow canvas bag to his son. The little boy was never tired at looking at me, Master Harry, for I was bright then, and beautiful, and shone like gold, or like my sister there. The little boy would take me out with him, and one day I and my companions in the yellow bag were snatched from his hand. There was an immense hue and cry, a halloo, stop thief, a scuffle, a hurry, a great deal of running, and presently two stout fellows in flannel coats and with great flopped hats and with stockings rolled up above the knees of their breeches. "What a word, to be sure!" cried the pretty lady, hiding her face with her shield. Came up, holding a pale young fellow, thin, gaunt, and ragged, by both his arms. They brought back the purse, and presently a tipstaff came and took the young thief, who was only 20 years of age, the nursemaid, and my young master, to the magistrate. The thief was at his penitentials at once, and cried, and talked about a starving wife and child, but they committed him and hauled him to prison at once. There had been a great stir made about robberies and the clumsiness of the watch, and they were determined to make an example. My young master cried very much for his purse and penny piece, but they kept that as proof, for I was the only piece the nurse could swear to. Poor fellow! What he said was true. His wife and child were starving, but they didn't think that any excuse, and one morning the young fellow was brought out with 4 others, one highwayman, one forger, a burglar, and a woman who had stolen a piece of meat, and was with them hanged until he was dead. "What, for stealing a tenpence?" cried Harry indignantly. "Ah, poor fellow, yes. They did so in those days. Poor man." "What, pity a thief?" cried the duchess-like lady. "Oh, my!" "I am not the only one who has taken pity on a thief," returned the other calmly. I was next changed away, for I did not return to young master, for some strong waters by one of the watchmen, and I fell into the hands of a dashing young publican, at whose house some of the gentlemen of the road used to call. The highwayman robbed a stage-coach, took all the money from a Quaker, and, out of a careless good nature, gave me, with a handful of others, into the outstretched hands of a poor usher who had ridden up to London in search of employment in the basket of the coach. "Just like those wicked wretches. They take sovereigns and notes and gold watches and what not, and then give away penny pieces in charity." "Like other people, too," returned the ragged figure. "I was given up by the usher in charge to a man who kept a cellar in Monmouth Street, near 7 Dials, where he sold boiled beef, and gave as large a dinner as his customers could eat for 6 pence. I was not long in his possession, nor need I have been, for the greasy hands of the Irish waitress took away all my brightness, and I had already been knocked about a good deal." "I dare say," said her companion, in high disdain. "Then you should take care what company you keep." "Wait," said the other. "Wait till you get out into the world. You will be rubbed against strange companions. You will not always be able to keep your freshness and your polish. You will have to mourn over a change day by day, over loss of high looks, high thoughts, and a brave, fresh mind which once thought it could conquer everything. You do not know what a little rubbing with the world does for the like of us." "Nor do I want, madam." "Perhaps not," said the other sadly. "But want it or not, time brings it to all of us, soon enough, heaven knows. I was next given by the Irish maid to a very thin, poor gentleman, who wore a silver-hilted sword, tin shoe-buckles, a brown wig, and a hat with some copper lace on it. By an agreement, he limited his supply of meat each day to 3 pence, and I noticed that when I fell into his pocket that I had only 2 other pennies, a penknife, and a tobacco-box to rattle against. He was a poet, and wrote for the magazines of the period, and filled the pocket-books, published them, with these beautiful verses and charades which were all at the end. He made a very poor living at it, though, and often slept in the bulks at Covent Garden with 1 or 2 other gentlemen of his craft, who would laugh and talk with each other very bravely and beautifully, never railing against fortune except to call her a jade and to quote poetry against her. When imprisoned in his pocket, I used to think him mad. He kept me a long time, though, for taking me out by the moonlight to pay for some tobacco, I looked so new that he rubbed me on his coat sleeve and said he would keep me as a pocket piece for good luck, so he might always have a coin about him. He did so for a long time, but being at last lodged with the poor debtors in the Fleet prison, he tossed me away, a halfpenny at a venture, with the Fleet parson, just to kill time. The parson, who was not then much plagued with marriages, the fees of which alone paid him, gave me away to a turnkey for a tin of beer, and the turnkey gave me to a poor prisoner who was starving there to buy a penny loaf. I do not know whether the man was too weak to live or whether the bread choked him. Certainly he died with a part of it in his mouth. I went away to a baker's boy who, having been given a money-box, had commenced saving. He kept me a prisoner many years, till he came to a man's estate, and then I was changed into other moneys, but I was black, battered, and bruised by the constant shaking and moving in that little miser's box. "Oh, what a vulgar story yours is!" cried the lady, yawning. "I will not trouble you long," said the other. "I have been the first penny which commenced the fortune of a millionaire. I have been the last which a spendthrift who has run through an ancient estate and has brought an honourable house to nothing has spent. I have been good, and been the means of good. I have dropped from the hands of sainted charity into a beggar's hat. I have been part of the sum which bought a human soul. I have bribed innocence and corrupted virtue." "That's a pretty confession to make, quotha." "True, it is so," said the old woman. "But nevertheless, I have lived." As she spoke the magical word, she seemed to grow a finer, stronger woman. True, her face was worn, and her helmet and shield bent, but her form seemed straighter and more shapely, whilst the brightness of the other grew more like tinsel glitter. The old figure did indeed remind Harry of a picture of a duchess, and he did not doubt the old lady's assertion about her maternal great-grandmother. "I have lived," cried the old Britannia. "I have seen life, its joys and sorrows. I have been the happy coin given by a hard-working mechanic to his child as a Christmas box. I have been the treasured penny spent at last to buy an orange to moisten a mother's dying lips. I have been portion of the washed coin brought by obsequious waiters at a whitebait dinner for young gentlemen to throw to the little wretches who die for coppers in the black mud of the Thames. I have travelled from London to the country. I have been in the pocket of a ploughboy bard, and have been spent at fairing times and market days as a penny should be. Spend and be spent. That is the rule of life. What else do we live for? Better rub than rust a great deal. Better be worn away than be eaten by verdigris and poison copperas, and such rust as too much rest must bring to all." It was perfectly amazing to see what a change came over little Harry's vision. Here was the bright penny piece, absolutely looking ashamed before the old worn one, and the latter holding herself upright like a queen. "Let us live, let us rub and get shabby, if you will," she continued, "rather than do nothing. I declare I would not be a lazy drone for half the world. Fine clothes, in faith, we all wear the same clothes when we come out of the mint, the workers and the wearers, and for myself I would rather rub and wear and wear, month by month and day by day, assisting Jack, offending Tom, living by Harry, and keeping Ned. Live and let live, you know, young woman." Prodigious! She absolutely dared to poke the finely dressed creature with her old worn trident, whereat the other shrank away, I promise you. "Then do nothing all my days but be looked at, be worth nothing but to wear fine clothes, make nothing but work for others, and say nothing but talk about weariness and ennui? That's not the life for me, not if I were to be shut up in the velvet-lined mahogany cabinet of a connoisseur, with a parlour to myself, nay, nor even if, like a holy recluse, I were to be closed in the foundation of a church, harmless, quiet, and apart from all. I am for a life of activity," she said with a smile, "for I am a circulating medium, I am. And so, goodbye." Tingle, clatter, and roll. Then a little jump and a slam, and the 2 penny spirits are shut in the money box. Harry opened his eyes. It was dark. He shut them for a time, opened them again. It was light and morning. He did not caress his fine penny so much as before, and whether or no he absolutely saw what I tell you he did, and heard all I have related, I do not know. But I know this. He was ever after more lenient to worn faces and old clothes, and did not think much of a brand new penny piece, knowing that in the eyes of the wise and of the great master of the mint it is of just the same value as, and of no more than, the shabbiest old penny in the kingdom, provided always that the metal of the latter be good. I really like this story. I like how when it starts out, we think it's going to be just another toy come to life story like Eleanor's Christmas, a story from last year. But this is so much more substantial than that, and becomes a very moving piece of writing about class and poverty, about age and life, about the value of experience and respect for time. The old coin story is so compelling, and what she says about living life fully, even when it means rubbing up on strangers and getting worn out, is a really powerful message. I also think the introduction is pretty charming, where Harry's parents like him so much and they're so amused that they keep giving him more coins, even though he has the coin he wanted. Speaking of coins, this story really forced me to do a deep dive on British currency. The coins are described in the story. The old coin says, "She saw the light when old King George III was a young man, and she bears his head upon her." That means she's what's also called a cartwheel Britannia, the type pictured here. She also mentions being modeled after Frances Stuart, Duchess of Richmond, which is true. Frances Stuart was a famous beauty of her day, and she captured the heart of King Charles II, although she famously refused to become his mistress. When Charles had a medal designed to commemorate the 1667 Peace of Breda, her face was used as a model for Britannia. And then in 1672, that image was used as a reference for the design of Britannia that would appear on British coins to this day. That's incredible. So the new coin has a picture of Our Lady the Queen and a good deal of Latin on one side. That makes her Queen Victoria, and the Latin says Victoria de Gratia Britanniarum Regina Fidei Defensor, forgive my pronunciation. In English, that is Victoria by the grace of God, of the Britain's Queen, Defender of the Faith. In 1876, they added to the coins Empress of India, but that's well after our story was published. The Britannias, by the way, on the coins are identical, but they are facing the opposite ways. There's a tradition going back to the Stuart kings that British monarchs alternate the direction they're facing on their coins. Naturally, all this led me down a crazy and fascinating diversion into British currency in general. Did you know that the British penny alone has 2 entire Wikipedia entries, one for the current penny and the other for the pre-decimal penny? And all this led me to the insane and wonderful Carolingian monetary system. Okay, so apparently, back in the 8th century, the Emperor Charlemagne undertook a major currency reform that affected basically all of Europe for centuries. Before him, all of Europe was using kind of the dregs of the Roman currency system, which was based on the value of gold. So there was a solid gold coin called a solidus or numisma, and the values were declared by the emperor, right? So Diocletian had a system where solidus was worth 10 argenti, 40 numi, 20 radiates, 500 laureates, and 1,000 denarii. Constantine, meanwhile, declared the solidus worth 2 scripula, 3.3 tremices, etc. But after the decline of the Romans in Europe, there were a ton of different units of measurements and everything. So Charlemagne stepped in to standardize the currency. He also introduced silver currency since gold had to be imported from abroad, but silver could be mined in Europe. So the basic Carolingian system had 3 denominations in units of 1 libra or pound, to 20 solidus or shillings, to 240 denarius or pennies. Having a standardized currency system made it much easier for people to trade with each other, and so it was rapidly adopted, first by the British Isles and the Hanseatic regions, and then it spread throughout Europe. So regardless of what people called their currency locally, it tended to retain this 1 to 20 to 240 ratio. So, in the 18th century, so 1,000 years later, the process of decimalization began to occur, where countries modified their currency into units based on powers of 10. The Russians were the first to decimalize, beginning as early as 1534 and completing the process after the October Revolution. Likewise, France updated their currency and decimalized after the French Revolution in 1795. The Dutch were next. They decimalized the guilder without a revolution in 1817. But the UK, bless them, held on to the Carolingian system until 1971, except for the florin introduced in 1849, which was worth 1/10 of a pound. Aside from that, the system had 1 pound equal 20 shillings, 1 shilling equal 12 pennies, 1 penny equal to 2 halfpennies or 4 farthings. There were also crowns and half crowns, guineas, and sovereigns, but I can't really figure out where they fit into this ratio system. So there were literally decades of reports and committees and commissions and recommendations before finally, 15th of February 1971, decimal day, when they revised the currency system. And all in one day, they rolled out the new bills and coins and started retiring the old ones. And they put up all these conversion charts everywhere. And they had this massive public education effort, which included like catchy pop songs and these sketches on the BBC where a granny like learns the new currency system. If you listen all the way to the end of the video, you get to hear me make a little confession. Tonight's confession is that, of course, I'm looking at the old British currency system and I'm wondering if that's just another thing where those of us who are older memorized some very complex process for doing something, but now there's no need for that type of specialized knowledge. We have like whole regions of our brain set aside for remembering telephone numbers or driving directions or state capitals or something we will never need to know again. It is true that the brain is incredibly flexible and it is always possible to create new connections and learn new information. But likewise, it is virtually impossible to forget some old things like your grandmother's phone number or your first pet's name. Some stuff just gets all the way in there and we keep carrying it around long past its usefulness. But, damn it, to quote this old Britannia, we've lived. If you like old stories and unnecessary information and you've made it this far, subscribe to the channel. Every week I bring you weird, old, odd stories and you wouldn't want to miss anything. Please also drop me a like or a comment and consider sharing this video with someone who would like it. Finally, if you want to help me out a bit more, use the link below to buy me a coffee. Thank you so much for your support, and I will see you in a few days.